Woo! Time to try out these bad boys. Alright, so, welcome back to another review. This time we're taking a look at the Fostex Dekoni Blues. So for those of you who are unaware, Dekoni went ahead and grabbed a pair of T50RP Mark IIIs, slightly tuned down the drivers, slapped a pair of limited edition cups with the Dekoni Blue logo and vertical sound wave, then replaced the stock pads with their very own hybrid pads, and put them out for sale. So how did Dekoni's mod affect the sound of these headphones? Well, let's find out. Now, before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, you know the whole ordeal down below. Thank you very much, I appreciate it. So let's begin with the content here. The contents are pretty straightforward. You get a pair of the Dekoni Blues, obviously. You get a 1/4 inch to L-shaped 3.5mm tip ring sleeve cable with a locking mechanism on the headphone end, a 1/4 inch to 3.5mm tip ring sleeve adapter, and a cool box that doesn't really serve a purpose other than to show you that you did in fact buy a mod, not the original headphone. Thank you, Dekoni. Very cool. So let's jump straight into the build quality. Don't let their looks fool you. These are a semi-open back headphone. In short, it features some benefits and detriments from open and closed backs, but more on that later. Now, they're pretty much built entirely of plastic. The top of the headband might look flat, but it has a slight amount of spongy foam on the top and the bottom. As I mentioned before, the stock pads were replaced with Dekoni's hybrid pads, featuring pleather on the outer portion and velour on the inner portion that makes contact with your head. Go ahead and give you a better look there. Now, they don't particularly feel like they're built like a tank or anything, but they definitely feel like they'll last if you take care of them a little. Now, let's talk about the comfort here. Man, these things are comfy. I'd almost give these a 10 if it weren't for the fact that they slightly slip off of my head whenever I look down. That and the fact that it is one-sided. I despise that, but... So the padding up top is very, very close to perfect. It doesn't feel like other massive pads that make you think you have like a giant log on your head. And those ear pads? They're just perfect. I mean, they're not memory foam or anything. They really don't need to be, you know? It's got a little bit of memory foam action going on, but it's not super memory foam either. They don't really depress all that much when they're actually on your head, but of course mine are brand new, so your mileage may vary. The majority of the time, these are an absolute pleasure to have on your head. Now, real quickly, amplification. I went ahead and tried these out on 2 different amplifiers. On the THX AAA 789, I ran them at about 1 PM on gain 2, and I ran them at about 10:30 AM on gain 3. Now, on the Dark Voice, I ran these at about 7:30 AM. Did I mention that the Dark Voice is extremely powerful? Well, that went by pretty quickly. Let's approach the sound. Now, as usual, the following impressions were taken through single-ended from a solid-state amplifier. No EQ or variations will be applied or discussed until the notes and observations portion of this review. Now, with that out of the way, let's begin. So let's start off with the bass, and if you've heard anything about these, yeah, can confirm that it's definitely elevated here. A good amount of boom is present in the mid bass, but there's also a pretty respectable amount of sub bass going on too. Now, that typical trade-off is seen in most headphones. You know, you want the big bass, you gotta suffer the poomp. I wish I could say it was clean, but it just isn't. Granted, it's definitely cleaner than what a dynamic driver can do with elevated bass, but that doesn't mean it's good. Bass guitars definitely sound bloated, but I don't think it completely ruins their quality. They still sound pretty textured, though with more fat on that rib, if that makes any sense. So let's go over an example here, The Hammer by Deathclock. Surprisingly, that warm bass note that hovers around the 180 Hz wasn't terribly affected by the bloat. By the way, more on that later. It still doesn't sound great, though in this particular case, that's not really the fault of the headphones, is it? Now, another example here, Purple Lamborghini by Skrillex and Rick Ross. Yep, that sub bass is just crazy. It's insane. If I had to be very specific as to how it sounds, I'd say I can hear like a very audible and clean sub bass note, but then there's a thick wall of cotton in between my ears and the note itself. Oh, it's almost as if I stuffed the inside of the cups with cotton before actually putting them on. Another example, Zealots of Stockholm by Childish Gambino. Yeah, that note is warm AF. It's just, that's all I have to say. Warm. The sub bass note at 305 is very forward and present and just keeps hitting and hitting and hitting until it just cuts off. Same thing on the recovery. There's nothing there, nothing there, nothing there. Boom! There it is. Just back. all of a sudden. Now let's talk about the mids in this headphone, the underdog, if you will. The mids in general do get overshadowed by the bass, and in some cases the treble too. Female vocals tend to have this overly warm sound that really just doesn't hit as strong as it should. So I'll bring on an example here. Dream On, the Postmodern Jukebox cover, the overly warm string bass envelops the rest of the sounds and stops everything else from shining. It can even be difficult to hear the most intricate of sounds in the main verses. So when the cello comes on, it sounds too warm for its own good, but for what it's worth, the pizzicato does have a great amount of detail to it, mostly since the string bass takes a back seat here. Now let's talk about that treble. Generally speaking, the treble is in fact forward and in your face. The S range definitely presents sibilance in most instances, and the overall timbre of the response is sparkly and crystalline. That said, only the S range manages to come forward and stand above the rest of the sounds. Instruments like cymbals gain that silvery timbre to it, but they don't come so forward that it begins to bother you. So that is a bit of a relief there. Now I could give a number of examples here, from Bangarang by Skrillex and Syra to Hazy Shade of Winter, the Gerard Way and Ray Toro cover. In both of these the hold on. In both of these, the forwardness is extremely apparent. Now, I will say though, they aren't extremely airy, but they are not lacking in it either. Yeah, generally speaking, that treble response is just kind of jagged, kind of peaky. It's just really not my cup of tea. But now let's go ahead and raise the spirits again a little. Let's talk about the Soundstage and imaging. So these are semi-open back headphones, but for all intents and purposes, feel free to consider these a completely closed pair. Thus far, that's the sort of sound impression these have given me. Well, it's no different when it comes to Soundstage. These are quite closed in and are moderate to narrow. For a closed pair, you'd say they're on the slightly wider side, but for an open pair, you'd definitely agree that they sound trapped. There's not a lot of height to the Soundstage, nor is there a lot of width. Generally speaking, I really can't complain about the width. The height is okay, and the width, in my opinion, is acceptable. However, it's enclosed in nature that begins to bother me. It's something I generally just can't stand in closed headphones, and one of the biggest reasons I only own a single pair for necessities. Imaging, however, is one aspect that these will actually surprise you. If you recall from my video on the Sennheiser HD800S, I presented the metaphor about food on a plate. These actually possess a good amount of these elements too. So for those of you that are new to the channel here, go ahead, like, comment, and subscribe. Imagine an empty plate in front of you. Now imagine it's got a variety of foods on it. For example, mashed potatoes here, beans there, corn there, etc. With most headphones, these foods are touching each other without any real borders. Instruments in a track tend to touch each other, and even though you can tell that the sound is right here or here next to it, it's hard to tell where that particular sound stops and the other one begins. Now imagine that very same plate of food, but imagine those same foods coexisting on the same plate without ever touching each other. Now that's what I could clearly pick up with the HD800S, and that's what I can pick up with the Blues in a good amount of scenarios. And in case you didn't realize it, that's a good thing. So just to give an example of that, take a listen to Saturn's Bars by Gorillaz featuring Popcorn. There are lots of sounds, vocals, and instruments placed and moved around all of the soundstage throughout the entire track. I can clearly tell where a particular sound is headed and where it lies exactly. Yeah, that is prime right there. That's preem. And yes, I'm still a fan of Cyberpunk. I know it dumped, but shh. Now let's discuss the notes and observations here. So after applying some EQ, I managed to tweak a few things here and there. That valley in the low end manages to reduce that meatiness created by the mid bass to the point where there's still a little bit of meat left, but with most of the rumble. In the sub bass, to be clear. I brought the mids forward since they felt quite scooped initially. Definite improvement there. Lastly, I reduced the treble by just a smidge to mitigate some of that glare in the high end. Though I tried not to get rid of too much of it, or else it would make the Blues sound a little, blue. Now keep in mind, these adjustments aren't perfect, and you are more than welcome to deviate from this formula as you see fit. Also, with regards to comfort, I did eventually encounter a bit of a hot spot at the very top of my head. Nothing terrible, but it was there. I also found that I really couldn't wear these for longer periods, not because of comfort issues. They tend to introduce that deprivation tank effect I tend to get from closed back headphones and IEMs. Conclusion. These are... These are, I won't stand here and tell you these are absolutely horrible. That would be unjust considering the few good traits that they've got going on for them. However, I'd be doing a disservice to you if I told you these are some of the better $200 headphones in today's market. Now, if this were 5 to 10 years ago, I'd accept that these simply have their own flaws, but must be weighed considering your priorities. But this is not 5 to 10 years ago. No, this is a new audio era where yesteryear's competitors have stepped it up and shown tremendous strides against the long-standing pillars of audiophilia. We've got giants being toppled and a new one rising in their stead all the time. So my thoughts on these are, while they most certainly do have some impressive bass and imaging capabilities, the fact that they sacrifice the mids and the highs to achieve this, they make these a tough sell. Look, if you had shown these to my high school self, who was obsessed with finding the headphones and earphones with the biggest bass around, he would absolutely praise the bass in these, but would have returned them immediately due to that jagged treble response. Well, I'd say immediately, but no, I would have probably thought about it long and hard, because I would have been like, but that bass, but that treble, but that bass, but that treble. That's just the type of picky little bitch I was. I was both very picky and very ignorant when it came to audio enthusiast gear. But anyway, that's going to do it for me. Once again, don't forget to check out the links down below. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the deal. Hopefully it really shed some light into your purchasing decision. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.